Hello and welcome to a brand new series of the Jack's Throwback Attack podcast. Hello there, thank you for listening. Yes, I am back after a break with another series of podcasts. My fifth one, can you believe it? The podcast, for anyone new listening, is my conversations with people who worked both in front and behind the cameras on some iconic kids' TV shows in the 90s and noughties. There's plenty of previous episodes to listen to as well. Today, we're chatting with someone who has worked mostly behind the camera for this episode. Lots of great stories. Hope you enjoy it. So I'm pleased to have with me Nic Ayling, who's here to talk about some memories of working behind the scenes on some iconic kids shows down the years. Hello.
Hello there.
How are you keeping today?
I'm very good. How are you? Thank you so much for letting me come onto your show. I'm really looking forward to it.
No problem at all. Yes, I'm fine, thank you. And I hope things are well down in Maidstone in Kent, because I know that's pretty much your second home, the Maidstone studios.
It is, yes. I've probably spent more time here than anywhere else in my life. So, I'm very fond of the place, and I'm sitting in one of the production offices that would have been a production office in TVS days. I'm sitting there now speaking to you, so it's really good.
Fantastic stuff. Well, I know that your interest in television started from a very young age, didn't it?
That's right. Yeah, I was into Southern television. I grew up in Kent, not far from these studios, and I was a big fan of Southern television, the local ITV station based across southern England. And then when I was about 10 years old, it lost its franchise, and I didn't quite understand what that meant. So I decided to research it. And I got really, really into the history of Southern television and the fact they had two studios, one in Southampton and one in Dover at the time. And then I started collecting memorabilia to do with Southern, particularly the Dover studio, because it had a lot of quirks, shall I say. And then this new company, TVS, suddenly came along, and they announced that they were going to build these studios in Maidstone and close Dover. And I thought, right, one day I'm going to try and get a job there. And I was very fortunate because a few years later, I ended up being on one of the shows here. And then when I left school, I got a job, and here I've stayed, really.
That's great stuff. So it's great that you realised your dream, basically. That's very nice.
Yeah, it's like, because I didn't go to a particularly good secondary school. They still have grammar schools here in Kent, and still have the 11 plus exam. So I didn't pass my 11 plus. So I went to a secondary modern school, and it was quite good fun. I never remember doing any homework. We couldn't do O levels at that school, now called GCSEs, but it was still O levels in my day. So I just had a lot of fun. Got into Number 73, this television program that TVS were making, and I thought, do you know what? One day I'm going to be on that program. It was presented by Sandy Toksvig. She was the main presenter, although she was Number 73 was actually hosted by actors, really, rather than presenters, because it had a drama-based storyline. So it was a house in Maidstone, actually shot in Studio 2 here, and bands would come and go. Ethel was the owner of the house. There'd be guests, all sorts of things. So although it was set in a studio, to all intents and purposes, it was in this really crazy house in the south of England. I got so into the programme. In the end, I sent this long picture in. It was 25 foot long. And the researcher at the time, a chap called Tim Edmonds, whose name you might know, he got in contact with me and said, would you like to come on the show? I, of course, said yes. He came to visit me and my parents, and said to my mum, I think it was, do you think Nicholas, as I was Nicholas in those days, do you think Nicholas could cope with live television? My mum said, oh, I should imagine so. And that was it, really. I then, within a few weeks, I was one of the kids on Number 73, which was also hosted by Neil Buchanan. And that was how eventually I got into Art Attack and all those other great shows, because Tim Edmonds, that original researcher, and Neil Buchanan when TVS finished up, set up the Media Merchants, and then I went to work for them.
So yeah, you mentioned that you ended up working quite heavily with Tim and Neil with the Media Merchants once TVS folded, and probably the main show of that and your career for a very long time was Art Attack. You worked on that for pretty much the entire run, didn't you?
I did, yes. I joined on the last TVS series, and again, I just got a call one day from Tim Edmonds. I remember I was at home and still at my parents', and it was Tim, and he said, "Nick, do you know who this is?" I said, "Oh, Tim, how are things? How's looking good?" Because he just brought back How for TVS. He said, "Oh, have you seen Art Attack?" And I was, "Yeah, brilliant show, really enjoying it." He said, "Well, we're going from, I think it was from 7 episodes to 10, and we think it will be quite difficult." Now, when you think we ended up doing 25, 30 episodes a series in the end, but back then it was a big deal going up to 10 episodes, I think it was. So we need someone else to help with the artwork. Did you end up studying art at school? And I said, well, no, I didn't. And I explained the whole thing about the school I was at. And he said, well, come in anyway and have a chat to Neil and myself. And we can have a good old catch up and a cup of tea. And so I just thought it was quite a nice thing to do. It was a summer's day, came up here on the train, and we went to the canteen, had a cup of tea. And Neil asked me to draw something. I can always remember it. It was like a countryside scene with mountains in the background and a plane in the sky. And he was saying, right, now draw a fence, now draw a river. So I just sat there and did all of this stuff. And Neil had remembered the drawings that I'd done on number 73 and all the address captions that I'd done on number 73. So I'm sure he had something in the back of his mind. Anyway, at the end of it, I said, well, do you fancy coming to work on Art Attack for the summer? And I went, well, yeah, that'd be brilliant. And at that point, I didn't quite know whether I was going to go and study A levels or go to university or whatever. So I thought, well, do you know what? I'll come here for the summer, see what happens. And it was literally as simple as that. I came here that summer and I stayed. I was on Art Attack then, and well, gosh, you probably know the dates more than me. Near enough until it finished in 2007, was it? It finished, Jack? You probably know.
2007 was the year it finished broadcasting, so I'm guessing
right,
it would have been
okay.
the year before that they finished filming.
I didn't actually do the very last series, so because I decided at that point I needed to think about what I was actually going to do in life, because it was a bit like being on a soap opera. I was so typecast. I was working on Art Attack, so I started on that job. That first job was. They called me an assistant graphic designer, I think, or something. We didn't really have runners in those days, but I was essentially a runner. And of course, by the end of it, I was the series producer. But I never expected it to go on, to go on for that amount of time. And then at the very end, I said to Tim, I don't think I'll do the last series. We all knew it was going to be the last series. So I sort of bowed out. And by that point, Louise Lamb, who'd been a researcher on the programme, was produced the last few series, and it was great fun. I mean, I've got so many stories and so many memories, and it was a lot of work for a long time, and it was great fun working with great people, and I was very, very fortunate because I've got no qualifications in art. But I sort of had a flair for it, I guess. And we'd have researchers on the show who had fine art degrees, and they'd come along and say, oh, I think we should do this. And I'd actually say, that's great. But actually think about the kid at home. Would they be able to achieve that? And you're using this expensive paint. I always had a rule when I was producing Art Attack. All the ingredients and all the things you use had to either come from the art cupboard at school or from a branch of Woolworths. Dear Woolworths, and if you had to go to a specialist art shop to get something, then actually it shouldn't be in the show. And all that was learned from Neil, really. Neil and Tim, they were brilliant teachers. I mean, they taught me and Driana, my business partner now, but Adriana and I worked on Art Attack together for many years. They taught us how to make TV properly. Our other friend Helen Evans, who I must mention, or Helen Dawson as she was then, the three of us really in those early days were. It was a fabulous time. It was a very small, close-knit team, and we had we had a great time, but never really thought how popular it was until all of a sudden we got involved with doing the international versions, and Disney came knocking on our door saying we want a version for France and Spain and Italy and South America, and we ended up doing so many versions. So when we weren't, people thought we were doing Art Attack for a few months a year in Maidstone. We were actually doing it all year, and the team got bigger and bigger and bigger. So big, in fact, we had to have porta cabins in the car park, and we were just making Art Attack in these porta cabins because we needed so much space, because we were making episodes upon episodes for all these territories. And all the presenters thought they were sort of coming to London and going to have a nice time, and they were a bit gutted when they came to Maidstone. There's nothing wrong with Maidstone at all, but I think they thought they were going to sort of be sightseeing in London. But again, great days, great teams, and I'm still friends with lots of them now.
That's great stuff, and it's really lovely to hear stories of Art Attack. Of course, very popular show, as you know, because we've been in contact for many years, a show that I absolutely adore. Lots of particular bits that I remember really enjoying or trying to make. I mean, like you say, you could talk about it for hours, and I could ask you questions about it for hours, but we haven't got the time. But if we could, like, perhaps talk about perhaps one particular make or picture that really stands out for you as like your favourite, if you've got one.
Oh, difficult question, but there was, let's think, Series 8, I think it was. We did a thing called a Vicious Vicious. Do you remember it?
Yes.
Okay, so this was a paper mache or papier mache, but Neil always said paper mache. Probably still does. I still speak to Neil a lot, so I'll have to ask him. But it was he'd been to America on holiday with his family, and he'd seen this Vicious Vicious in a shop, and he'd taken a photograph of it, a Polaroid, I seem to remember, and he'd given it to me. And as a researcher, he'd say, "Nick, what do you reckon?" I said, "Oh yeah, no, I think that would be quite good." And I remember Neil and I sitting together and basically doing a version of the Vicious Vicious, and we came up with a colour scheme and how we wanted it to be. And basically, it was a paper mache tank with this sort of fish in it that was a bit like a piranha, I guess, all cartoony with big eyes. And so we'd come up with this idea. Anyway, at that point, I had to think about breaking it down. And in those days, we used to record each item near enough as live. Neil was brilliant. You do a lot of stopping and starting now, but in those days, God, it makes me sound ancient, but we used to record the programme on 1-inch tape when I first started, reel-to-reel tape, which was a bit of a nightmare to edit, not like digital editing these days. So what we would tend to do is we would tend to shoot an item, if we could, in one go as live. And that was great. And Neil was brilliant at it. He never used auto cue. He was really, really good. 3 cameras in the studio. We'd have a top shot, perhaps one over the shoulder, and a camera out front. But the only problem with that is we had to do loads and loads of versions for. We never actually said, "Here's one I made earlier," but we used to have versions under the desk. We used to have left of frame, right of frame, so he could bring stuff in because there wasn't really a lot of time for it to dry. So as a result, I'd worked out that I needed to make 52 of these things at various stages, and they all had to look exactly the same because of the continuity, and they all had to. The newspaper, they were made of newspaper, which was a nightmare for continuity. In the end, we got newspaper printed, so all the headlines looked the same and all that sort of thing. But I was still at home. I ended up making all these things because I had to make so many of them one weekend in my mum and dad's conservatory, and they'd been out, they came home. The place was running with condensation because I'd been doing all this paper mache. And they said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm making some Vicious Vicious for Neil." And that's, that's sort of the way, that's sort of the way we rolled. And I loved it. I loved the item. I thought it was a great item. We also did it's just reminded me, we did a doorstop out of an old trainer. I don't know if you remember that. So
Yeah.
you get a train, an old train, and you fill it with stones, cover it in paper mache, and paint it like the trainer. Well, that was my item. So I worked out there that I needed for all the stages something like 60 trainers, but the trainers, we said they were old trainers. To get 60 old trainers that all look the same, all left or right footed, I can't remember which one they were, it's nigh on impossible. So I had to buy 60 trainers, and I spent about a week on the steps at the studios here, scuffing them in exactly the same place to make them look old. And everyone would walk by and say, "What are you doing?" But, you know, we had to have multiples, absolute multiples of these things. When we were doing big pictures, we did a big picture once with biscuits. And we had like hundreds of custard creams and bourbons. So for the rest of the series, we were all eating bourbons and custard creams. I mean, Pringles, the amount of Pringle tubes we used. I mean, it was crazy, absolutely crazy. But going back to your original question, I think Fisher's was a really good one. It was another one, actually, margarine lid Christmas cards.
Yep, remember that.
Which was, I think, from the second or third Christmas cracker. Really, I love that item, and that was the first item that I'd actually invented entirely myself, and I was very proud of that one because Neil said, "Yeah, absolutely, it's great. Put it on the telly," and I did, and yeah, it's still I still have one somewhere actually. I have to find it and show it to you. It's one of the few things I kept from the series. I've got a couple of pencils from the set and a few bits and pieces. But the Marge Lid card was a pretty good one.
I remember it because both that and the Vicious Vicious ended up on the videos that they released in the late 90s. So they are both immortalised on VHS, both of those.
Brilliant stuff.
And just going, you said about having to make all the different versions. I can understand now why in the later shows and the international ones why it was pre-filmed inserts with somebody's hands doing them, because you wouldn't be able to do it another 30 times over.
No, it wouldn't have been impossible. You could have done it, but also when we made the international shows, we needed presenters who could present really, but it's very difficult to get a really good presenter who's good with props, but who's also a brilliant artist. So that was a way of actually allowing, I mean, we never said the hands were not the presenters. They weren't the presenters' hands. We never said they actually were, but we actually got the idea from the Delia Smith cookery video when there were some close-ups of Delia Smith's hands. It was on a VHS we had in the office. And we looked at it and we went, are they Delia's hands or not? We couldn't work out. I mean, they may well have been Delia's hands. They probably were. And that was the inspiration, really, for doing that hands type thing, which actually it's been replicated now on quite a lot of TV shows, and you see it online. But I think we shot those all in a couple of days in Studio One here in Maidstone, and then we would play them into the studio so the international presenters could actually get their head around what they were supposed to be doing. And yes, in the end, when we were doing lots of shows, Art Attack, the UK version, sort of adopted some of that. I was always very fond of Neil's, we called them tips, where he would actually draw something as well from start to finish, because Tim always used to say they were mesmeric, and they really were, because they'd just stick the top shot on the caption card, and Neil would just draw the galleon or whatever in the scene, and you know, he really was drawing them. You know, some people said, did he really do the artwork? Well, yes, he did, and he had help, obviously, because it was impossible in the end because there was so much. So he had help, but you know, I would go to his house sometimes and write the scripts. When I was producing the show, we'd sit down and write the scripts together. And you know, he had brilliant, and still does, brilliant ideas.
Definitely. I mean, I'll just quickly mention my favourites. I mean, I could list.
Oh yes,
I could
yes,
list so many. I'll try and keep it brief. So, ones that stick out for me. You saying about the drawing and that, and the painting. There was one's a painting of a ship using a piece of cardboard. Remember that one was.
That's
a good
the
one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Series 6, I think.
I think it was. Also, the only thing I ever made from start to finish was a garbage gobbler. I did actually make one. I tried to make 3D noughts and crosses and failed.
3D deluxe noughts and crosses.
That was it.
I think.
And my favourite big picture would have to be the Chinese dragon out of lentils, which everybody seems to remember.
Ah, yes. Yeah. Well, so I was the person just off camera filling those boxes with lentils because Neil had, I don't know, about half a dozen boxes there with the perfect pour, so they'd all been scalpelled out, and then I had a big bag of lentils. I went to Safeways, which was a supermarket down the road, and I bought all these lentils, and I was just off camera, and every time he finished one, I was there filling the next one and filling the next. I think I seem to remember doing the same thing with bird food as well for a budget picture around the same time. Yeah. You talk about the garbage gobbler, actually. We got to meet the Queen at one point, the late Queen, and we took the garbage gobbler along. The programme had won an award for international sales because we'd sold to so many countries, and we got invited to meet the Queen, and her people said, please bring some props along, and one of them was the garbage gobbler, and I do remember her asking Neil about the garbage gobbler. She was very impressed with that one.
It was good, certainly was. You worked on the head parts of Art Attack quite a lot, and had a good working relationship with Francis, didn't you?
I did, yeah. Francis Wright was an absolute genius with the head. Really good fun, and we had a real laugh working on that. The early series, Tim Edmonds wrote, and then I took over writing all the head gags and all the head nonsense, and it was nonsense, but it was really good fun. And actually, my quite mediocre scripts at the time were made 100% better by Francis and his performance. But he was so gracious, he really was, because I was this 20-something, he was a seasoned actor, and he was reading and performing my words, and he never had an issue. He only ever gave me one bit of advice, and I pass it on now to everyone, and that is he said, young man, never put etc. in a script, and I've never done it since. And if anyone does it, I give them the same advice, because he was like, well, what do you expect me to say? But yeah, no, I'm still in touch with Francis Wright, and I'm very happy to have worked with him. And I think the head was a great sort of sorbet, really, from the Neil parts of the show. I think it really helped Art Attack breathe. We went from the first two series. It was a real person. It was a person with makeup on. It was I think series 1. It was Jim Sweeney, and I think Andrew O'Connor. Series 2, and there was an attendant played by Peter Corey. He was actually one of the writers on number 73. Everything Connects. And then series 3, it was a chroma key gallery, and Francis came in and it became a puppet. Series 4 was chroma key, and series 5, I think, and then series 6. This studio was so busy, we couldn't get into the studio to shoot the head, so we shot it at TVS. Had a warehouse the other side of Maidstone. We shot it in there one weekend, but of course we couldn't. In those days, it was difficult to do chroma key on location, so we actually had a real set built, and it was a sort of a port wine colour set. And that went down so well that after that, at that point, it then went back into the studio. We decided to have a real set. The following year, it was repainted, and I came up with that green and sort of cream colour scheme at the Heads Gallery. I came up came up with that with Helen Dawson. We found the Kevin MacLeod book. Kevin MacLeod from Grand Designs. On the shelf was the Kevin MacLeod book of paint effects, and that colorway was either on the front cover or quite early on. And I said, "Oh, I really like that, Helen." And so we gave it to the set designer at the time, and that's how the head gallery became that color. So yeah, but really good, really happy times. And the fact he did the voice as well as the puppeteering was great. One year, we shot it in the old newsroom here, for what I can't remember why, on a weekend. Tim Edmonds was supposed to direct it, and then for whatever reasons, I think Tim was sick or something, so Helen and I stumbled through it. But because we weren't in a studio, Francis couldn't get the eyes to work, so I had to sit on the mezzanine floor with the controller, and I'm actually operating his eyes in that series. I think it might be in the Art Attack scrapbook. Do you remember that one?
Yeah.
It was a sort of a compilation series. If you look, the set looks a bit strange in that one. That's because it wasn't shot in the studio at all. It was shot in the newsroom, and there's a line at the top of the set, and that's because we had to cut the set in half to get it through the doors.
I love stories like that. That's fantastic. So moving on to some of the other Media Merchant shows. Obviously my other big favourite is Zzzap. You worked on that as well, sometimes in between breaks of doing Art Attack, is that right?
That's correct, yeah. So I that was more once we got into a bit of a rhythm with the Media Merchants, Driana, who was heavily involved in Art Attack in the early days, she split off to work on Zzzap, first as the AP, and then she produced the last few series. And I stayed with Helen Dawson on Art Attack. And then when Helen left, I then took over from Helen on Art Attack. But so Zzzap was very much going on at the same time as Art Attack. So I would do bits and pieces on Zzzap. I did a lot of handyman stuff because that was very much like Art Attack. That was great fun to do, and we did that in the studio. But also, I was Neil would often get me to play the odd character, and I can be seen in quite a few Cuthbert Lily sketches, actually playing irate park keepers, and I'm a checkout boy in one. I'm a fish counter assistant in another. All those we shot up the road at Tesco's in Maidstone. I did. I got involved in some of the location stuff in the early days. I did some very early. I think the first year of Daisy Dares, I was out on location, sort of helping out with that. But I can't claim that I did a great deal on Zzzap. It was. I mean, we shared an office, and great teams worked on Zzzap as well. But that was very much in the end Driana's baby, and I'd get a call saying, "Oh, can you play a zookeeper? The actor hasn't turned up." Well, I'm in the middle of doing some paper mashing. It was like, "Oh, right then." It was very much like that, really.
Yeah, I have noticed, because obviously I've known you for a while now and watching episodes, that yes, you do pop up on Zzzap a lot. You pop up on Art Attack and It's a Mystery and Sooty.
Oh, It's a Mystery.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, all those classics.
There he is again. Yeah. Zzzap was fantastic. It was my favourite show. Art Attack was a close second. Two top fantastic programs that are still very, very well remembered, even though it's been such a long time now for both of them. The amount of people who still talk about Art Attack and Zzzap, we get letters to the studio still asking, have you got any memorabilia? People of your age who want, who grew up watching the shows, or have you got this? Have you got that? Have you got an old postcard? And we try our best, but it's very, very, very slim pickings now. Yeah.
But it's lovely. It's lovely to hear, and I'm, if I ever bump into anyone from school, which is, it was a long time ago, I was at school now, the first thing they say to me is number 73, and people of a certain age, again, remember number 73 so well, and Neil being in 73 and the art items, because Neil did his first art item on number 73. TVS made another show called Do It, and that's where Neil did his first big picture. He did a tiger out of rice. Have you ever seen that, Jack?
I think I have, yes, on YouTube.
Yeah,
When I was.
yeah. So that was his first. That was his first big picture. And the Brighton Bottle Orchestra were on that show, and they are Miller and Porter, who did all our theme tunes. So everything connects.
It does indeed. It does indeed. It's funny, really, because like if you search hashtag Art Attack Zzzap, whatever on Instagram, you'll be guaranteed to see at least a few Halloween dress-ups or Comic Cons, because I know I've done it. A lot of people have done it since, and so if you ever look, it's quite a thing. So yeah, that's interesting. I just wanted to move on to, because I know from speaking to you in the past, you also worked on It's a Mystery, and that was something that you really enjoyed working on.
Yeah.
What a great show as well. And different, really. I don't think there was a paranormal investigation show for children. You know, it's quite something.
I loved It's a Mystery, as you say, and it was probably one of my favourite shows ever to work on, because Art Attack and Zzzap were amazing, but they were a certain type of show. They were quite niche. And by the time I got onto It's a Mystery, which started around 95, 96, I was asked by Tim and Neil to work on it. I'd only ever really done art-based items. So actually, it was a bit of a risk for them to get me on it as a researcher. Anyway, I lapped it up. And on that show, I learned to write, I learned to direct, I learned to do archive research, I learned to cast, because it was lots of different sort of, if you've not seen the show, it was a strange but true type show, but had lots of little dramas and reconstructions in it, as well as studio items that were very much like how can a headache tablet cure a headache, things like that. But we just started them with It's a Mystery. So it's a mystery how a tablet can cure a headache. But we had 5 great series of that. I worked on all of them, and yeah, I had a whale of a time. And I still get. There was a particular item that we did about a haunting. I think it was supposed to be in Spain somewhere. Some faces appeared on a floor under a kitchen, and it's on YouTube somewhere, and the amount of people that still talk about that is quite incredible. And we shot that 20, I think it was about 1999, so 24 years ago. We recorded that. We had no budget to make It's a Mystery, and so we did have to make do and mend quite a lot. And actually, watching it back sometimes now, I think, how I would have done that differently now. But then I think about, well, actually, we didn't have a great deal. We didn't have a great deal of money, so we did the best we could. And actually, I'm really proud of it.
Yeah, I really like the show. I do have some memories of it. But one of the things I did notice, again, going back to your TV appearances, is It's a Mystery did cover Southern TV's greatest mystery of that hijack that happened back in the 70s, which has recently been, been worked out. But you're in that reconstruction as the newsreader, aren't you?
I am. Well, it's interesting you say that. So that was obviously my item. Actually, there's a lot more information out there about it now, so it's not wholly accurate. Yeah. But anyway, we did a reconstruction, and I said, wouldn't it be fun if I played the newsreader? So I did, and I wanted to get the Southern logo behind me. And at that time, the Southern TV name and logo and archive was owned by a company called Primetime. So I wrote to them and I just said, "Oh, look, do you mind if we use it?" And actually, they said, "Oh, yeah, that's absolutely fine." So I was in my element then. I really milked it for all it was, for all it was worth. And we had the Southern logo on, and we kept showing the Southern logo and the Southern studios in Southampton. Yeah. And it was that connection that I sort of stayed in contact with. And then a few years later, I ended up buying Southern Television. So again, it's thanks to It's a Mystery, I think.
It all comes around. It
does.
I had an episode on tape. Unfortunately, I don't have it anymore, but I remember it so distinctly. I remember the first story was about a guy gets arrested, and it turns out he has the same name, date of birth, bank card as his policeman. And then there was also a story about a floating ball of lightning that was terrorising the village or something. Remember that one?
That's right, yeah. The name one was, I think that was series 3. and I seem to remember shooting something in a phone box near Maidstone Station, even though we said it had happened in Scotland. So what we would do is we'd get Scottish actors in, we would shoot it in Maidstone. I was saying, we had to make the budget stretch, and that was a fun one. And I seem to remember the UFO one, which I remember the UFO was made by a graphic designer who we worked with a lot, called Alan Scragg, fabulous chap. He'd worked for Southern and TBS. And he did a lot of our graphics, as did David Tasker, who designed the Art Attack logo, with Neil. That I seem to remember us doing that in a house in Maidstone, and it was the makeup lady's son who was playing one of the kids in that story, who's probably got kids of his own now.
The other thing I wanted to briefly mention is because pretty much your entire career has been behind the camera, but for a brief time you did do some presenting of your own on Quids Inn and Slop's Diner. How did you get into that, and what made you kind of not do it after? Why did you go back to behind the camera?
Well, I was always a big fan, still am, of a programme. It was a consumer programme called That's Life, which was on the BBC from the early 70s to about 94, I think. And it was a consumer show presented by Esther Ranson. And it had light-hearted items in it, and it had some quite hard-hitting items. But anyway, they always had silly things in it, like Getting Britain Singing and Jobsworth Awards. And I took a shine to it. And I always wanted to be one of... So you'd have Esther Ranson, and then you'd have her sort of team of Esther's boys, they called them. So they were sort of journalists, the lads who were presenting the items with her. And I always thought, well, one day I'd like to be on that show and be one of the presenters with Esther Ranson. Obviously, it never happened. But at the end of, I think it was series 6 of Art Attack, Tim Edmonds came to me and he said, I know you love That's Life. Why don't you do a consumer item in the studio and we'll film it just for a laugh? And in those days, you could. I mean, it would have cost a fortune, and you just couldn't do it now. But in those days, it was a bit easier. So I said, "Oh, okay." So I had full makeup, full costume, full lighting, full props, full everything, and we shot it. We shot this item in the studio, and I was doing a consumer type item about this optic lamp that someone had bought. And I got a standing ovation afterwards, and I thought, oh, that'd be fun to keep. Anyway, unbeknownst to me, they'd sent that off to Channel 4, and within 6 months, we were shooting a pilot called The Pocket Money Show, which was a consumer show for children, which then ran to a series called Quids Inn. And so that is how that happened. Again, thanks to Tim and Neil, I wrote and presented that. It was really, really good fun. And it was going to go to a second series, and then Hollyoaks came along, and they decided to stop all the kids' programs. Hollyoaks took all the budget, and that was the end of that. But again, I never set out to be a presenter, so I wasn't that upset. I fell into it, and then Telegantic Megavision came along, which was which only ran for one series, but they had a little quiz show element in that, and Tim and Neil, perhaps they felt bad about Quids Inn, and they asked me if I wanted to present that, which I did, and it was fine. But I then decided, do you know what? I want to get a mortgage. I'm never going to be a great presenter. So actually, if I want to stay in TV, I think I need to work behind the scenes. But so that was really the reason. I was never going to be a great presenter. I don't think I wouldn't have been able to sustain a career as a presenter. So I decided that I'd work behind the scenes.
That's fair enough. I mean, I didn't realise until a friend pointed it out that the co-host in Slop's Diner is shot Phil Mitchell.
Yes, Lucy Benjamin. Yeah. She was great fun. So she was roller skating around the studio as my co-host, and she was great. I seem to remember we shot 7 a day. I mean, it was exhausting. And for someone who I'd never been I hadn't trained as a multi-camera director, and that was shot multi-camera. And it was directed by a great director, sadly no longer with us, called Michael Kerrigan, who directed a lot of TVS programs, including Number 73. We had a ball, but it was exhausting, and everyone was so lovely and helpful, and got me through those days. But Would I want to do it again? Absolutely not.
That's fair enough. Before I move on to the kind of post-media merchant stuff, there is one thing I wanted to bring up that I'm interested in, actually, because I like these shows. You did also do some non-kids TV stuff on early Channel 5, 100% and Whittle, which is interesting. How did that kind of come about?
Well, and actually, I did Sailor the Century as well in the early days as well for that may have been for Challenge TV. I can't quite remember now, but it was all made by it was all made by Grundy. So I was happily here, and I was doing the Telegantic and then the Saturday morning show that took over from it called Wow, and then it was Christmas '96, I think, or '97 it could have been. I bought my first flat. And I was really excited. It was the tiniest flat you've ever seen, but I'd actually got on the housing ladder. I was going to work on the Saturday morning show that was going to continue after Christmas. I remember getting the mortgage in the December, and then in the January, I was going to have a long run working as a researcher on a Saturday morning show. And then I think ITV got the Formula One or something, and they decided to put all the money in that. It was the story of my life. So suddenly I was like, what am I going to do? And I asked around the studios here in Maidstone because there was nothing at the Media Merchants. And up to this point, I'd always been freelance. I had a conversation with a lady who used to work here, and actually she worked in Dover as well, Denise Buckland, great character. And I said, oh, look, Denise, I don't know what I'm going to do. I've just got this mortgage. Is there anything going on here? And she said, well, actually, we need someone, a Grundy are in, and they need someone to answer the phones. You've answered the phones, haven't you? And I assumed she meant on a live programme on a Saturday morning show. And I said, oh, yeah, I've done that. Anyway, I turned up at the office on the Monday. And it was literally to sit in an office while everyone was in the studio just answering the phones. Anyway, within a couple of days, the producer, a guy called Mark Nodes, he said to me, he said, actually, we need some help with some research, and would you mind doing that? And actually, we need someone to write some prize descriptions. And I wrote this prize description I always remember, for a Hinari bread maker that was on Sailor the Century. And I think that was the thing that clinched it. And he said, oh, yeah, we've got this thing called Whittle coming on because Channel 5's about to start, and Grundy are major shareholders. And so I ended up for about 6 months, because there was no work in Maidstone, working at Grundy House, as it was, next to London Weekend on the South Bank, working on lots of their quiz shows as a researcher, including 100%, and I thoroughly enjoyed it because it was completely different to what I'd been used to, and it was hugely varied. I learnt a lot. We moved halfway through from Grundy House to Stephen Street, and I remember I was a researcher on the first 30 episodes of 100%, which we shot there. It was the first thing ever shot there, and it was being built around us, and I was seeing contestants in through the fire doors, and there were fan heaters everywhere because it was freezing cold, and there was no catering, and it was all a bit shambolic. But we got on air. I really enjoyed it, and I've got a lot of affection for that time. Actually, I got a pay rise as well, and so they offered me a staff job, and I said, well, I really want to go back to Maidstone. When Art Attack came back, and they were very gracious, said, yeah, absolutely. And because I'd worked there, I got a pay rise when I came back, so I was very happy.
Not too bad.
Good old Red Grundy.
Not too bad at all. Not too bad. Okay, so moving on to kind of post-Media Merchants, you moved on to working on to probably the next big art show for children. It's kind of successor, I suppose, for CBeebies, and that was Mr. Maker. I know you've got a lot of affection for that and a lot of crazy stories.
Yes, I have. Well, just before we go there, I did Fingertips between the two, which was an ITV arts show as well. So the producer of that show happened to leave at the time I'd finished up on Art Attack. That was also made in this building by another great team who'd also worked in the children's department of TVS, and I got asked if I wanted to do that, which I did, and that was great fun. Really enjoyed that. Tim Dixon and Naomi Wilkinson presented that series that I did. It was the last series before ITV really stopped making programmes at that point. And loved it. I literally crossed the car park, went from a porter cabin to the main building, and we made 30 episodes of Fingertips, which I really, really enjoyed. And then while I was doing that, the company that made Fingertips had just started Mr. Maker Foundation, the company, now part of Banerjee. And they, Adriana had then, by that time, had made the first series of Mr. Maker and said, we need some, this is getting bigger and bigger. Would you join us? So I did. And there I was on Mr. Maker. And I stayed on that for many years, many, many years. And that physically took me all around the world, because Mr. Maker at that point was bigger, I think, than Art Attack. So we would do tours of South Africa, South America, Indonesia, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia. I mean, it was absolutely crazy. So we'd make the UK series, and then we would do live shows all around the world. And it was just Phil and myself would turn up, not quite knowing what was going to happen. Phil Gallagher plays Mr. Maker, not quite knowing what was going to happen. And my strongest memory of the live tours was it was about 10 years ago, and we were in the middle of Indonesia and we couldn't move because there was traffic everywhere. We were trying to get to a shopping mall. We were going to do a meet and greet, or he was going to do a meet and greet, 100 kids, just some signatures and photographs. Really big in Indonesia, we found out, Mr. Maker. And we couldn't get to the venue, and we were panicking, and the BBC representative was panicking. It was what are we going to do? What are we going to do? The reason we couldn't get there is they were queuing to see him. We got to the venue, or the shopping mall, and there was people everywhere. We were expecting 100 people. They estimated there was 10,000 people there.
Wow.
And we said, well, we can't do a meet and greet. What are we going to do? I remember saying to someone, can you find a couple of microphones? So they found a couple of microphones. There was no stage, but there was a big speaker. We stood on this big speaker in the shopping mall, the Pejatan Mall in Indonesia, in Jakarta. And we ad-libbed, I think it was about a half-hour show, to 10,000 people. It was unbelievable. And after that, we had to have escorts everywhere, police escorts everywhere in Indonesia, because we couldn't go anywhere. And we even had someone staying outside the hotel, because trying to keep these people away. It was absolutely bonkers, but great fun, great fun.
That's great to hear. Fantastic. And so to kind of wrap things up then, in more recent years, you decided to set up your own production company with
Yes.
Driana and a few others.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about that, and of course the iconic show that you are responsible for bringing back as well in recent times.
Yeah, so it got to 2015, 2016. I was touring around the world with Phil, Mr. Maker. We'd done a couple of UK tours around theatres in the UK, and we were touring Butlins, holiday centres, resorts, as they're called now, which again was great fun. But I was getting a bit exhausted because I'm knocking on a bit. And I thought, right, what am I going to do now? I didn't know whether I was going to sort of go into semi-retirement, and I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. Driana at that point was working on the reincarnation of Teletubbies, and we were chatting away because we're very good friends. I said, oh, should we just see if we can give it a go? So we came up with an idea for a cookery show. We took it to Kay Bembo at the BBC. We'll be forever grateful to Kay. And she loved the idea and said, right, who am I commissioning? And we hadn't even set up a company. I mean, it was comical, Jack. So we said, oh, we'll get back to you. And she said, well, I need to do this, that and the other and speak to various people. Anyway, within a month, we'd set up Terrific Television. I was always a big fan of alliteration. I liked Thames Television, Media Merchants. I thought, Terrific Television, that sounds good. I thought that will have gone, but actually it hadn't gone and been registered. So we set it up and we did My World's Kitchen. We've subsequently made 60 episodes of that. We've made Popcast for CVBiz. We've made How for CITV. We brought back How, which we can talk about in a moment. And we've made The Makery for Sky. We've made a version of The Makery. So a bit like Art Attack, really, for NBC in the US. So it's Driana and I have been been really fortunate in that respect that we can still make programmes in Maidstone, our favourite place. And yes, a few years ago we got the opportunity to bring back How, which Triana and I had both worked on How too, as what they called stringers. So because we were working on Art Attack and it was the same team, if ever we came up with an idea, we'd give it to the How team. Tim Edmonds was also the producer of How. We'd give it to the How team, and if they liked it, they'd give us 50 quid, and we'd have an item on How too. So we loved it, and we thought, wouldn't it be great if we could get the rights to it and bring it back? Didn't think anything would happen. We thought, don't ask, you don't get. We got an option on the rights thanks to Nigel Pickard, a name that again goes back to TVS and Number 73. He was the original director of Number 73, but he became very powerful within ITV. We got the rights to it, and we made 2 series of it. And I said, I'm only interested in doing it if Fred Dinage can come back in a certain... however, we write him in, but Fred has been in 400 episodes of How and How To. I said, he's got to be in every episode. And ITV were very gracious, and they said, yeah, okay, Fred can be in it. And so Fred did have a little cameo in every single episode, and I knew Fred from old. He was, and still is, fabulous. And yeah, it did really, really well. And unfortunately, it's only finished because it was funded by the Young Audiences, or part funded by the Young Audiences Content Fund, which was a pilot fund from the government to encourage children's production. But unfortunately, that fund's now finished. So all those shows that were funded or part funded by the Act Fund have unfortunately gone. But, we live in hope. How has disappeared and come back many times. There have been 3 versions of it now. And if anyone out there listening wants us to make How for them, any broadcasters, then I'd very happily do it. Just get in touch.
Fingers crossed, because it is a fantastic show, and I actually loved the new. Despite the fact I'm not in the target audience, I loved it. I got a lot of the references. I thought it was a very different version because I was, but at the same time, it still had enough of the old in it to please the older people. So.
We tried, and ITV were very insistent that it had to be updated, and they wanted us to be out on location. We managed to get some studio in, and the studio, we changed the studio. But How is an amazing format. Jack Hargreaves, who set it up, who was Deputy Controller of Programmes at Southern, and also presenter of the original series, was a genius. And I still think it's a cracking format and so simple. I'd love to do it again. But It's a Mystery, as I said, was very much like How, and I think that's probably why I enjoyed It's a Mystery so much.
Brilliant stuff. Nick, it's been fantastic chatting about your memories. Thank you so much for taking part today.
Oh, no worries. It's been an absolute delight.
A big thanks to Nick for sharing his memories, and check out Terrific Television and the great work they do. That's it for now. I'll be back soon, and thanks for listening.